in the heart of Natchez, where the Mississippi River swallows both bodies and secrets. One woman turned her master's cruelty against him and made the river her witness. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear it. And if you are enjoying the content, give the video a like to help support the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The Mississippi River in the late 1840s was more than water and current. It was the lifeblood of commerce, the highway of cotton and commerce, and the silent keeper of countless untold stories. Along its banks, plantations stretched like kingdoms, their fields white with cotton, their quarters dark with suffering. In Natchez, Mississippi, where the bluffs rose high above the churning water, the river was both promise and threat, opportunity and executioner. It gave life to the land and took life from those who dared to dream of freedom. This is where Naomi's story begins, in a place where the river knew more secrets than any human mouth would ever speak. Naomi was 23 years old in the autumn of 1848, though she had long since stopped counting the seasons of her life, with any hope attached to their passing. She was neither tall nor imposing in stature, but there was something in her bearing that set her apart from the other enslaved people on the Whitmore estate. Perhaps it was the way she watched everything with eyes that missed nothing, or the way she moved through her work with a quiet efficiency that suggested a mind always thinking, always calculating, always observing. Her hands were calloused from years of labor, her back strong from carrying burdens no human should have to bear. But her spirit, though tested beyond measure, had not yet broken. She had been born on the Whitmore plantation, as had her mother before her, and she knew no other world than this one of endless cotton rows and the overseer's whip. But Naomi possessed something that Colonel Whitmore had never been able to beat out of her. She had an intimate understanding of the land itself, particularly the river that defined their existence. She knew when the Mississippi would rise and when it would fall. She could read the sky and predict the storms that would bring flooding rains. She understood the currents, the sandbars, the places where the water ran deep and treacherous, and the spots where a person might cross safely if they knew the secret paths beneath the surface. This knowledge had been passed down to her by her father, a man who had worked the riverboats before being sold inland, and she had spent her childhood absorbing every lesson he could teach her before he too disappeared into the machinery of slavery's commerce. Her brother Isaiah had possessed that same knowledge, that same keen understanding of the river's moods and mysteries. He had been 2 years older than Naomi, blessed with their father's wisdom and their mother's courage. Isaiah had been her protector, her teacher, her companion in a world that offered precious little companionship. They had whispered together in the dark quarters at night, speaking of freedom the way other people spoke of heaven, as something beautiful and distant and perhaps impossible, but worth dreaming of nonetheless. Isaiah had taught her to read the stars, to navigate by the moss on the trees, to understand which plants could heal and which could harm. He had prepared her, though neither of them knew it at the time, for survival. In the spring of 1846, when the cotton was just beginning to push through the dark soil and the river was running high with snowmelt from the distant north, Isaiah had made his attempt. He had not told Naomi of his plans, perhaps to protect her, perhaps because he knew she would try to stop him or insist on coming along. But one morning he was simply gone, and by afternoon the dogs had found him 3 miles downriver, exhausted and hiding in a hollow cypress tree. They brought him back in chains, and Colonel Whitmore, a man who prided himself on maintaining order through exemplary punishment, decided to make an example that no one on the plantation would ever forget. Colonel Marcus Whitmore was 52 years old, a veteran of the Mexican War, and a man whose reputation extended far beyond the boundaries of his own property. He was known throughout Adams County as a successful planter, a shrewd businessman, and a pillar of the community who attended church every Sunday and entertained the finest families of Natchez in his columned mansion overlooking the river. He spoke eloquently about duty and civilization and the natural order of things. He quoted scripture when it suited him and the law when it served his purposes. To the white society of Natchez, he was a gentleman. To the people he enslaved, he was something else entirely. Whitmore had developed a particular method of punishment for those who attempted to escape. He believed that whipping, while effective, was commonplace and ultimately forgettable. He wanted something that would sear itself into the memory of every person who witnessed it, something that would extinguish not just the act of rebellion, but the very thought of it. And so he had turned to the river itself. That same river that so many enslaved people dreamed of following north to freedom. He would make the river an instrument of terror rather than hope, a destroyer rather than a deliverer. They brought Isaiah to the riverbank on a morning when the mist still clung to the water and the current ran swift and brown with spring flooding. Every enslaved person on the plantation was forced to line the bank and watch. Naomi stood among them, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest, her hands clenched so tight that her nails drew blood from her palms. She wanted to scream, to run, to throw herself at the colonel's feet and beg for mercy, but she knew with terrible certainty that any such action would only make Isaiah's suffering worse and likely condemn her to join him. Colonel Whitmore stood on a small rise where everyone could see him clearly. He was dressed impeccably, as always, in a dark suit that seemed absurdly formal for the occasion. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and measured, almost gentle, which somehow made his words more horrifying. He spoke of duty and obedience, of the natural order that God himself had established, of the consequences that must follow when that order was disrupted. He spoke as though he were delivering a sermon rather than a death sentence, and perhaps to him there was no difference. They tied Isaiah's hands behind his back and bound his ankles together with rope. They attached a length of chain to the rope at his ankles, and to the chain they fastened a cotton sack filled with rocks from the riverbank. Then they made him walk, shuffling with his hobbled legs, to the very edge of the water where the bank dropped steeply away and the current swirled dark and hungry. Isaiah did not beg. He did not weep. He turned his head and found Naomi in the crowd, and for one eternal moment their eyes met. In that look, Naomi saw everything: his love for her, his sorrow at leaving her alone, his fear, yes, but also his defiance, his absolute refusal to let them see him broken, and something else, something that would sustain her through the years to come. A message that said, "This is not the end," that said, "You will survive," that said, "Remember." Then they pushed him in, and the river took him. He struggled, of course. Every human body fights against drowning with a desperation that transcends will or dignity. But the weight was too great and the current too strong, and within moments he was gone, pulled down into the brown water, disappeared as though he had never existed at all. The river flowed on, indifferent and eternal, carrying Isaiah's body downstream to some unknown destination, some unmarked grave in the mud and silt of the Mississippi's vast bed. Naomi did not cry. She could not afford to cry. Not there, not then, not with the colonel watching for any sign of continued rebellion in the faces of his property. She stood perfectly still, her face carefully blank, and she swallowed her grief like poison. But inside, something fundamental shifted. The fear that had always governed her actions, the calculation that said survival meant submission, began to give way to something else. It was not rage, not yet, though rage would come. It was something colder and more patient. It was the understanding that there are debts that must be paid, that there is a justice beyond the law, and that the river which had taken her brother might one day be the instrument of balance rather than cruelty. She carried that knowledge inside her like a stone for 2 years. She worked in the fields when she was told to work. She cooked when she was told to cook. She lowered her eyes when white. People passed and said yes, sir, and no, sir, in the appropriate places. She made herself invisible in the way that enslaved people learned to do, hiding her true self so deep that even she sometimes forgot where she had buried it. But she never forgot Isaiah, and she never forgot the river, and she never stopped watching Colonel Whitmore with eyes that calculated and planned and waited for the moment when the scales might tip in a different direction. That moment came in the autumn of 1848, when the rains began and did not stop. It had been a wet summer with storms rolling in from the Gulf with unusual frequency, and by September the ground was saturated. The creeks were running high, and the river was beginning to show signs of serious flooding. The planters watched the water level with growing concern, knowing that their entire year's profit sat in warehouses and fields that could be washed away if the levees failed. The enslaved people watched too, with different thoughts in their minds, knowing that flood meant chaos, and chaos sometimes meant opportunity. The rain fell for 3 weeks without meaningful pause. It was not always a downpour. Sometimes it was just a steady drizzle that soaked everything and left the world gray and cold. But it was constant and relentless. The Mississippi rose day by day, climbing up the banks, flooding the low fields, threatening the levees that were supposed to hold it back. Every able-bodied person on the plantation, enslaved and free, was pressed into service maintaining those levees, piling sandbags, reinforcing weak spots, working through the day and often through the night in the cold mud and driving rain. Naomi was sent to the levee with the others on a night when the wind was howling and the rain was coming down in sheets. The river was angry, swollen beyond anything she had seen in her lifetime, running fast and dark and full of debris. Trees that had been undermined by the rising water floated past like corpses. The sound of the water was deafening, a roar that made conversation nearly impossible. They worked by torchlight, which the rain kept trying to extinguish, passing sandbags along a human chain, shoring up the levee where water was beginning to seep through. It was perhaps 2 hours past midnight when the levee failed, not where they were working, but 100 yards downstream, where the pressure had found a weak point in the earthwork. It went suddenly, catastrophically, with a sound like thunder. A section of the levee, perhaps 20 feet wide, simply gave way, and the Mississippi, sensing victory, poured through the gap with terrible force. People screamed and scattered, dropping their sandbags and running for higher ground. The water spread rapidly across the low fields, swallowing everything in its path. In the chaos and darkness, with people running in all directions and the torches mostly extinguished, Naomi saw something that made her heart stop. Colonel Whitmore had been supervising from a position on top of the levee, and when the breach occurred, the ground beneath his feet had given way. She saw him stumble, saw him try to catch himself, saw him slide down the muddy slope toward the rushing water, and then she saw him swept away, his arms flailing, his mouth open in a scream she could not hear over the roar of the flood. Every instinct she possessed told her to turn away, to let the river have him, to let justice be served by the same force that had taken Isaiah. But something else, something she did not fully understand in that moment, made her move. Perhaps it was training so deep it had become reflex, the ingrained habit of responding when a white man was in danger. Perhaps it was the knowledge that if he drowned now in the chaos of the flood, there would be no satisfaction in it, no balance, no moment of recognition. Or perhaps it was simply that she saw an opportunity that was bigger than revenge, a chance to earn his trust in a way that would give her power she had never possessed before. She ran along the broken levee, following the direction of the current, watching where the colonel was being carried. She knew this stretch of river better than anyone, knew that 50 yards downstream there was a partially submerged tree, a massive oak that had fallen years ago and now served as a snag for debris. If she could reach that tree, she might be able to intercept him. She ran, her feet slipping in the mud, the rain blinding her until she reached the oak. She climbed out onto its trunk, bracing herself against the current, and reached out into the water. She felt his hand before she saw him, grasping wildly in the darkness. She caught his wrist with both of her hands and held on with all the strength she possessed, anchoring herself against the tree. He was heavy, made heavier by his water-soaked clothing and his panic, but she pulled with everything she had, using leverage and technique rather than pure strength, and slowly, inch by inch, she dragged him towards the tree. When he was close enough, he grabbed the trunk himself, coughing and gasping, and together they climbed out of the water and onto the relative safety of the fallen oak. They sat there in the rain and darkness, both of them shaking with cold and exhaustion and shock, while the river continued its rampage around them. Colonel Whitmore coughed and vomited water, and when he could finally speak, his voice was hoarse and shaking. He did not thank her immediately. Perhaps he was too shocked, or perhaps the habit of command ran so deep that gratitude toward someone he owned seemed unnatural. But he looked at her with something new in his eyes, something that might have been recognition that she had saved his life when she could easily have let him die. Eventually, others found them and helped them back to solid ground. The plantation was in chaos. Several buildings near the river had been destroyed or damaged. Fields were flooded. Livestock had drowned. It would take weeks to assess the full extent of the damage, and months or years to recover from it. But Colonel Whitmore was alive, pulled from the river by the same girl whose brother he had drowned 2 years before. In the days that followed, as the water slowly receded and the work of recovery began, Naomi tended to the colonel's injuries. He had bruised ribs, cuts from debris in the water, and a persistent cough from the water he had inhaled. The plantation mistress, a fragile woman who found the whole flood ordeal too overwhelming to cope with, had taken to her bed, and so it fell to Naomi to serve as the colonel's nurse and attendant. She brought him food and medicine. She changed the dressings on his wounds. She listened to him speak, sometimes feverishly, about the damage to the plantation and his plans for rebuilding. And all the while, as she played the role of devoted servant, as she listened and observed and learned, a plan was forming in her mind. It was forming slowly, carefully, with the same patient deliberation that the river itself employed as it wore away stone and carved new channels through the land. She had pulled Colonel Whitmore from the water, yes, but only so that the river could claim him properly, at the right time, in the right way. She had saved him not from mercy but from calculation, and now, as he grew to trust her and depend on her, she would prepare the justice that the Mississippi demanded. The river had taken her brother. It had been forced to serve as an instrument of the colonel's cruelty. But the river was not his servant. It was older than him, more powerful than him, more patient than him, and Naomi, who understood the river better than anyone, would teach him that truth. She would make him understand, in his final moments, that some debts must be paid, and that the river always, always collects what it is owed. The winter that followed the great flood was one of rebuilding and watchful patience. The Whitmore plantation, like many along the Mississippi, had suffered considerable damage, and every hand was needed to repair what the water had destroyed and salvage what could be saved. But for Naomi, the true work of those months was not the physical labor of reconstruction. It was the careful, invisible work of studying her adversary, earning his trust, and preparing the ground for a reckoning that only she knew was coming. Colonel Whitmore had always been a man who believed in his own invincibility, in the natural order that placed him at the apex of creation, and people like Naomi somewhere far below. near the level of livestock or useful tools, but his brush with death in the flooding river had shaken something in him. He was not transformed, not redeemed, not suddenly awakened to the humanity of those he enslaved. Such conversions, though beloved by romantic storytellers, rarely happened in the real world of the antebellum South, but he was reminded, in a way he could not quite ignore, of his own mortality, and he was aware, though he would never have articulated it this way, that he owed his life to a person he had never before considered capable of agency or decision. This subtle shift in his psychology was the opening that Naomi needed. She did not push. She did not overstep. She simply made herself indispensable in the small ways that accumulate over time into dependence. She learned his preferences and anticipated his needs. She understood when he wanted conversation and when he wanted silence. She demonstrated competence without ever seeming to challenge his authority. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she became not just another enslaved servant, but someone he relied upon, someone whose judgment he occasionally sought, someone he trusted to execute tasks without supervision. The other enslaved people on the plantation noticed the change in Naomi's position, though most did not understand what it meant. Some viewed her with suspicion, wondering if she had become too comfortable in the master's presence, too willing to serve. Others saw her as fortunate, having gained a slightly easier position through her act of rescue. Only a few, the oldest and wisest among them, recognized what she was doing. They saw the cold calculation in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. They noted the way she studied the colonel's routines, his habits, his movements around the plantation. They said nothing, but they watched and waited to see where her path would lead. Among those who understood was Elijah, a man in his 60s who had served as a kind of unofficial leader among the enslaved community. Elijah had known Naomi's father and had been like an uncle to her and Isaiah. He had survived decades of slavery through a combination of wisdom, patience, and an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. He had seen countless acts of resistance, both large and small, and he had learned to distinguish between futile rage and strategic patience. When he looked at Naomi, he recognized something of himself, and something of a determination that went deeper than mere survival. One evening in late January of 1849, when the air was cold and crisp and the workday had ended, Elijah found Naomi alone near the quarters. She was sitting on a stump, looking toward the river, which was running low and peaceful now, its autumn fury forgotten. He sat down near her without asking permission, the way elders can do, and for a long time they simply sat together in companionable silence. Finally, without looking at her, he spoke. His voice was low, barely above a whisper, the voice of someone who had learned long ago how to have conversations that must not be overheard. He said that he had been watching her, that he knew she was planning something, and that when the time came, if she needed help, she should ask. He did not say what he thought she was planning. He did not need to. They both knew, in the way that people who have suffered the same injustices know, that there are some debts that demand payment and some wounds that cannot heal without justice. Naomi did not confirm or deny his assumption. She simply nodded once and continued to look at the river, but she felt something ease in her chest, a tiny lessening of the terrible isolation she had carried since Isaiah's death. She was not completely alone in this. When the moment came, there would be at least one person who would understand what she had done and why she had done it. Through the winter and into the spring, Naomi continued her patient campaign. She studied the changes the flood had made to the riverbank, noting where the current had cut new channels and where sandbars had formed. She walked the perimeter of the plantation property on various errands, memorizing every feature of the landscape. She observed the colonel's schedule, learning when he rose, where he went, who he spoke with, and when he was most likely to be alone. She listened to him talk about the plantation's financial troubles, the loans he had taken to finance the repairs, the pressure he felt to produce a successful cotton crop, to pay back those debts. Colonel Whitmore's anxiety about the plantation's finances became another tool in Naomi's hands. He grew increasingly obsessive about the repairs to the damaged sections of the levee, wanting to personally inspect every bit of work to ensure it was done correctly. He trusted the enslaved laborers to do the physical work, but he did not trust them to make decisions about engineering or placement. That was gentleman's work, requiring judgment and intelligence that he believed only white men possessed. And so he made frequent trips to the riverbank to examine the progress, often alone or with only one or two attendants. Naomi began to suggest in her quiet way that certain sections of the bank were more vulnerable than others. She would mention, as though it were merely an observation, that the water seemed to be cutting differently in one spot, or that the soil seemed looser in another place. The colonel, who had come to value her knowledge of the river, would nod and make note of these observations. Slowly, without ever appearing to direct him, Naomi began to guide his attention toward one particular section of the bank, a place where the flood had undermined the soil, and where the current, even in its diminished state, still ran swift and deep. This section of the riverbank was not far from where Isaiah had been drowned. Naomi had chosen it deliberately, with a sense of poetic justice that gave her cold satisfaction. The colonel, of course, had no memory of the exact location where he had disposed of her brother. All spots along the river probably looked the same to him, indistinguishable drops of water in an ocean of cruelty. But Naomi remembered. She would always remember. The overseer, a man named Garrett, who had been hired after the flood to help manage the increased workload of rebuilding, began to notice Naomi's frequent presence around the colonel. He was a suspicious man by nature and profession, trained to watch for any sign of insubordination or plotting among the enslaved population. He pulled her aside one day in early April, when the dogwoods were blooming and the weather was beginning to warm, and questioned her about her activities. Naomi played the role perfectly. She lowered her eyes and spoke in the soft, deferential tone that white men expected and required. She explained that the colonel had asked for her assistance because of her knowledge of the river, that she was simply trying to help ensure the plantation's recovery, that she understood the importance of the cotton crop and wanted to do her part. She spoke of her gratitude for the colonel's mercy in not punishing her after her brother's escape attempt, conveniently rewriting history in a way that would satisfy Garrett's worldview. She presented herself as exactly what he wanted to see, a slave who had internalized her oppression so completely that she actively supported her own enslavement. Garrett seemed satisfied, or at least willing to turn his attention to other matters. But Naomi knew she had to be more careful. She could not afford to raise suspicions now, not when everything was finally coming together. She pulled back slightly, making herself less visible around the colonel for a few weeks, allowing the overseer's attention to wander elsewhere. She was playing a long game, and patience was her greatest weapon. During this time, she also began to have quiet conversations with other enslaved people, not about her plans directly, but about the river, about freedom, about resistance. She told stories in the evenings, old stories about people who had fought back in small ways and large, about trickster heroes who outwitted their oppressors, about the Underground Railroad and the people who had successfully made it north. She did not present herself as a leader or a revolutionary. She simply planted seeds, ideas that might grow into something more, a network of understanding that would be crucial when the moment finally arrived. One person who listened with particular attention was a young woman named Sarah, who had been brought to the plantation after the flood, sold by a neighboring planter who was facing his own financial troubles. Sarah was perhaps 18 years old, fierce and angry in the way that young people can be when they have not yet learned to mask their emotions. Naomi recognized something of herself in Sarah, or perhaps something of what she might have become if Isaiah's death had not taught her the value of cold patience over hot rage. She took Sarah aside one evening and spoke to her about survival, about the difference between resistance that gets you killed and resistance that actually accomplishes something. She told her that anger was natural and right, but that it needed to be channeled, controlled, saved for the moment when it could actually make a difference. She did not tell Sarah about her specific plans, but she made it clear that patience was not the same as submission, and that watching and waiting was sometimes the most radical act of all. As spring progressed into early summer, Colonel Whitmore's inspections of the levee became more frequent. The spring rains had been heavy again, not as catastrophic as the previous year, but enough to raise the river and test the repairs. The colonel was determined not to face another flood disaster, and his anxiety drove him to personally examine every foot of the levee system. Naomi made sure she was often available when he planned these inspections, offering to accompany him and point out any concerns she had noticed. On one such inspection in late May, as they walked along the repaired section of levee near the spot where Isaiah had died, the colonel slipped in the mud. It was a small thing, almost insignificant, but Naomi was there to steady him, to help him regain his footing. He laughed it off, embarrassed by his momentary loss of control. But Naomi noted the incident carefully. The ground here was treacherous, especially after rain. The bank was unstable, undermined by the previous year's flooding, and not yet fully settled. A person could easily lose their footing, especially if they were distracted or not paying attention to where they stepped. She began to arrange for small things to be left near this section of the bank. A coil of rope that had been used for securing boats, left casually as though someone had simply forgotten it. A few tools from the levee repair work, positioned in places that seemed natural but would require the colonel to move carefully around them if he came to inspect. She was setting a stage, arranging props, preparing for a performance that would have an audience of one and would play only once. Elijah helped without being asked explicitly. He made sure that work crews were not scheduled near that section of the bank on certain days. He arranged for equipment to be moved or stored in ways that suited Naomi's purposes. He did this so subtly that no one else noticed, and when Naomi thanked him with a glance, he simply nodded. He understood. He had always understood. By mid-June, everything was in place. The river was running high from late spring rains. The section of bank was as unstable as it was going to get without actually collapsing. The colonel's schedule had fallen into a predictable pattern, with his inspections typically happening early in the morning before the day's heat became oppressive. And Naomi had positioned herself as his trusted guide and assistant, the person he called upon when he wanted to check the levee. She waited for the right morning, a day when the sky was gray with approaching storms and the air was heavy with moisture. A day when the river was running swift and brown, when the current was strong enough to carry a man away quickly, when the mood of the water matched the mood of justice that Naomi had carried in her heart for more than 3 years. When the colonel asked her to accompany him to inspect the levee that morning, she said yes with the same quiet deference she had shown for months. She gathered the items he asked for, including the rope he wanted to use, to mark a section that needed additional work. She walked beside him toward the river, matching his pace, listening to him talk about his plans for the plantation and his hopes for the coming cotton harvest. And with every step, she felt the weight of 3 years of patient waiting begin to lift. With every step closer to the river, she felt Isaiah's presence beside her, guiding her, giving her strength. With every step, she felt the cold certainty that justice, delayed and denied by human law, would finally be served by a higher power. The river was waiting. The river remembered, and the river was about to collect what it was owed. The morning dawned gray and heavy with unspent rain, the kind of morning when the air itself seems to press down upon the earth with tangible weight. The Mississippi ran high and turbulent, swollen with runoff from storms upstream, its surface roiling with eddies and currents that spoke of the power moving beneath. Along the banks, mist clung to the water like breath, rising in wisps that the wind caught and scattered. It was the kind of morning that made people want to stay indoors, close to their fires. But Colonel Marcus Whitmore was a man driven by anxiety about his property, and anxiety made him careless about comfort. Naomi had risen before dawn, as she always did, and had prepared herself with the same careful attention she gave to everything in these final days of waiting. She dressed in her usual work clothes, a simple dress of rough cotton, worn and patched, the uniform of her enslavement. She tied her hair back with a piece of cloth. She ate a small breakfast, though her stomach was tight with anticipation. She went through the motions of her morning routine with deliberate calm, knowing that this day would be different from all the days that had come before, but showing nothing in her face or bearing that would alert anyone to that difference. When the colonel sent word that he wanted to inspect the levee and wanted her to accompany him, she received the message with the same quiet acknowledgement she had shown for months. She gathered the items he had requested, including the coil of rope that would ostensibly be used to mark sections needing repair. She felt the weight of that rope in her hands, felt the rough fiber against her palms, and thought about all the ways that rope could be used, all the purposes it might serve beyond its intended function. They walked together toward the river, just the two of them, as she had planned. The overseer was occupied with a crew working in a distant field. The other enslaved people were at their various tasks around the plantation. There was no one to observe, no one to interfere, no one to witness what was about to unfold except the river itself. And the river had learned long ago how to keep secrets. Colonel Whitmore talked as they walked, his voice carrying that peculiar quality of men who have never questioned their right to be heard. He spoke about his concerns for the levee, about the financial pressures he faced, about the cotton market and the prices he hoped to get for his crop. He spoke to her the way he might have spoken to himself, using her as a sounding board, not particularly interested in her responses, but comforted by the act of verbalizing his thoughts. He had come to trust her presence, to find it useful, and that trust would be his undoing. They reached the section of bank that Naomi had been preparing for months. It was perhaps 100 yards from the main plantation buildings, far enough that sounds would be lost in the noise of the river and the wind. The bank here dropped steeply to the water, and the flood damage from the previous year was still evident in the way the soil had been undercut and the way certain areas seemed unstable, ready to give way with the right pressure. The colonel stood at the edge, looking down at the water, frowning at something he saw in the pattern of the current. He stepped closer to the edge, trying to get a better view of a section of bank that seemed to be eroding. His foot came down on a patch of mud that looked solid but was underlaid with water-saturated clay. For a moment he seemed to hang in space, his arms windmilling as he fought for balance. Then he pitched forward and went down hard on his knees in the mud, sliding several inches closer to the edge before catching himself. Naomi was beside him instantly, as she had trained herself to be, as he had come to expect. But instead of helping him to his feet, she did something he did not expect at all. She took the rope from her shoulder and moved behind him with swift efficiency. Before he could fully understand what was happening, she had looped the rope around his wrists and pulled it tight, binding his hands behind his back with knots her father had taught her years ago, knots designed for securing boats against currents and storms, knots that would not slip or loosen, no matter how much they were strained against. The colonel's shock lasted perhaps 2 seconds before it gave way to outrage. He began to shout, to demand that she release him immediately, to threaten her with punishments so severe she could not imagine them. His voice rose to a roar, and he tried to stand, to turn, to use his weight and strength against her. But he was off balance, on his knees in slippery mud, with his hands bound behind him, and Naomi had positioned herself in a way that made it impossible for him to gain leverage. She did not speak. Not yet. She simply held the rope and waited for his initial fury to exhaust itself, waited for the reality of his situation to begin penetrating his understanding. She watched his face cycle through emotions, rage, disbelief, confusion, and then, slowly, the first cold touch of fear. He had spent his entire life in positions of absolute power, and he had no framework for understanding what was happening to him now, no experience that had prepared him for this reversal. When his shouting finally subsided into ragged breathing, when he seemed to realize that no help was coming and that she was not going to release him, Naomi spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet but absolutely clear, cutting through the sound of the wind and water with terrible precision. She said his full name, Colonel Marcus Whitmore. She said it the way you might say the name of someone you are identifying, someone you are marking for a specific purpose. Then she said a second name, Isaiah, her brother's name, spoken aloud perhaps for the first time since his death, given substance and weight by her voice after years of being reduced to memory and silence. The colonel's face showed confusion. He had likely forgotten the name, if he had ever known it at all. The enslaved people he owned were rarely individuals to him, rarely people with names and histories and families who loved them. They were assets, resources, labor measured in work hours and market value. But Naomi reminded him. She described the morning 3 years earlier, the morning when he had forced everyone to watch as her brother was drowned in this very stretch of river. She described it in detail with the precision of someone who had relived that moment every day since it happened, who had memorized every aspect of it, who had let it burn itself into her soul until it became her defining purpose. As she spoke, she saw recognition dawn in the colonel's eyes, and with recognition came understanding. He knew now why his hands were bound. He knew why they were here at the river's edge. He knew what she intended to do, and that knowledge transformed his face in a way she had never seen before. The mask of authority, of certainty, of unquestioned power cracked and fell away, leaving something raw and human and terrified beneath. He began to beg. The transformation was startling in its completeness. The man who had stood on this bank 3 years ago, calmly delivering a sermon about duty and order while a young man was murdered, now pleaded for his life with a desperation that stripped away every pretense of dignity. He offered her freedom, papers that would make her legally free, documents he could draw up immediately if she would only release him. He offered her money, more money than she had ever seen, enough to buy passage north and start a new life. He promised he would never hurt anyone again, that he would be a better master, a more merciful man. The words poured out of him in a torrent, each promise more extravagant than the last, each plea more desperate. He invoked God, begging her to show Christian mercy. He invoked the law, warning her that killing a white man would bring consequences she could not imagine. He tried anger again, threatening her with horrors, then switched back to pleading when he saw that threats had no effect. He cycled through every tool of manipulation and control he had ever possessed, and none of them worked because the balance of power had shifted completely and irrevocably. Naomi listened to all of it with an expression that remained unreadable. She had imagined this moment countless times over the past 3 years, and she had wondered how she would feel when it finally arrived. Would she feel triumph, satisfaction, joy at seeing her oppressor brought low. But what she actually felt was something quieter and colder. She felt the terrible weight of justice, the burden of being the instrument through which balance would be restored. She felt connected to something larger than herself, larger than him, larger than the personal grief that had driven her to this moment. When his pleas finally exhausted themselves into sobbing, when he had run through every argument and appeal he could conceive, Naomi spoke again. Her voice was still quiet, still controlled, but it carried a weight that made him fall silent and look at her with eyes that finally, for the first time in his life, saw an enslaved person as fully human, fully capable of judgment and decision and action. She told him about the years of planning, the months of patient waiting, the careful observation and preparation. She told him how she had saved him from the flood, not from mercy but from calculation, because his death then would have been random and meaningless, just another casualty of natural disaster. She told him how she had earned his trust deliberately, systematically, with the same kind of strategic thinking that he prided himself on in business and management. She told him that every moment of apparent loyalty had been preparation for this moment, that she had been thinking and planning and preparing while he had assumed she was incapable of anything beyond simple obedience. And then she told him the truth that he needed to hear, the truth that would be his final lesson. She told him that the river did not belong to him, that it had never belonged to him, despite his attempts to use it as an instrument of control, that the river was older than slavery, older than any human cruelty, and that it had its own justice that could not be subverted by human laws or customs. She told him that Isaiah was in that river, that his body had become part of the water and the mud and the endless flow, and that the river had been waiting all this time to balance the scales. She said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but somehow louder than any shout, "The river remembers." Then she began to pull him toward the edge. He fought, of course, with the strength of pure terror, but his bound hands and his position on the slippery bank gave him no leverage. She used the rope as a guide, letting his own weight work against him, using her knowledge of balance and force the way her father had taught her when she was a child, learning to manage boats against the current. Step by step, inch by inch, she moved him closer to the water while he thrashed and screamed and begged. When they reached the very edge, where the bank dropped away sharply and the current swirled brown and hungry, she paused. She looked at him one final time, this man who had owned her, who had killed her brother, who had believed himself untouchable and beyond judgment. She saw him reduced to pure fear, to animal desperation, to the primal understanding that death was upon him and there was no escape. And in that moment she felt something unexpected, not joy, not satisfaction, not even hatred. She felt pity, the kind of pity you might feel for any living thing facing its end, mixed with a cold certainty that this ending was necessary and right. She did not throw him in. She did not need to. She simply shifted her weight, let the rope go slack, and stepped back. The bank, undermined by the flood and softened by rain, gave way beneath him. For one brief moment he hung suspended, his eyes locked on hers, and then the Mississippi claimed him. The current took him immediately, pulling him under with a force that permitted no resistance. He surfaced once, 20 feet downstream, his mouth open in a scream or a gasp, and then he was gone, pulled down into the brown water, disappeared as though he had never existed at all. Naomi stood at the edge for a long time, watching the place where he had vanished. The river flowed on, indifferent and eternal, its surface already smooth and unremarkable where moments before it had been disrupted by a drowning man. A piece of driftwood floated past. A bird called from somewhere in the trees behind her. The world continued, unchanged by what had just occurred, and yet for Naomi everything had changed. She felt the grief she had been carrying for 3 years begin to shift, not disappearing but transforming into something different, not lighter exactly but more bearable, as though she had set down a burden she had been carrying so long she had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. Isaiah was still gone. Her mother was still dead. She was still enslaved, still trapped in a system that considered her property rather than person. But something fundamental had shifted in the order of things. A debt had been paid, a balance had been restored. The river had taken back what had been stolen from it. She turned away from the water and began to walk back toward the plantation buildings. She did not hurry. She did not run. She walked with the same steady pace she had maintained for years, giving no outward sign of what had just occurred. She knew that questions would come, that people would ask where the colonel was, that she would need to have answers ready. But she also knew that the river was a dangerous place, that accidents happened, that white men slipped and drowned with some regularity, especially when they insisted on inspecting flood-damaged banks alone, against the advice of those who knew the river better. She had prepared for this too, had thought through the story she would tell. The concerned servant who had watched her master inspect the levee, who had called out a warning when she saw him slip, who had tried to reach him but had been too late, who had watched helplessly as the current carried him away. It was a story that would fit with everyone's expectations, a story that cast her as helpless and subordinate, a story that no one would think to question too closely because it reinforced everything they already believed about the natural order of power and agency. When she reached the plantation buildings, she found Elijah working near the stables. She caught his eye for just a moment, and he saw something in her face that made him nod once, slowly, with a gravity that acknowledged what had been done and what it meant. He did not need to be told the details. He understood, and his understanding was enough. That evening, when the colonel had not returned and people began to search, Naomi told her story exactly as she had planned it. She spoke with apparent distress, her voice shaking in just the right way, her eyes downcast in apparent grief and shock. She described how the colonel had insisted on inspecting a dangerous section of bank despite her concerns, how she had watched in horror as the mud gave way beneath him, how she had tried to help, but the current had been too strong, too fast. She led them to the place where it had happened, pointed out the fresh break in the bank where the soil had collapsed, showed them the churning water that had carried him away. They believed her, of course. Why would they not? She was exactly what they expected her to be, a simple slave girl who had been fond of her master and was now grieving his loss. They searched for his body for days, dragging the river with hooks and nets, but the Mississippi, having claimed him, was in no hurry to give him back. Eventually they held a funeral with an empty casket and a tombstone that proclaimed Colonel Marcus Whitmore a pillar of the community, a respected planter and a Christian gentleman. Naomi attended the funeral, standing in the back with the other enslaved people, her head bowed in apparent mourning, and when the preacher spoke of God's mysterious ways and the tragedy of good men taken before their time, she felt no need to correct the record. Let them have their comfortable lies and their sanitized memories. She knew the truth. The river knew the truth. And Isaiah, wherever his body had come to rest, in the mud and silt of the Mississippi's vast bed, knew the truth as well. In the weeks that followed, as the plantation descended into uncertainty and confusion, as the colonel's debts came due and his widow prepared to sell the property, Naomi went about her work with the same quiet efficiency she had always shown. But at night, when she lay in her bunk in the quarters, she felt something she had not felt in years. Not happiness exactly, and certainly not safety or freedom, but a kind of peace. The peace that comes from having completed a task that needed to be completed, from having restored a balance that had been disrupted, from having proven to herself and to the universe that even the most powerless could find ways to demand justice when justice was denied. She had made her master beg for his life, and then she had given him to the river, and the river had accepted him as payment for a debt 3 years overdue. It was not freedom. It was not the end of her suffering or the dismantling of the system that oppressed her. But it was justice, and sometimes in a world that offered so little of it, justice was enough. The death of Colonel Marcus Whitmore sent ripples through Natchez society that extended far beyond the boundaries of his plantation. In the drawing rooms of the great houses that lined the bluffs above the Mississippi, his drowning became a cautionary tale about the dangers of being too hands-on with plantation management, about the risks of inspecting flood damage personally rather than sending overseers to do such dangerous work. His widow, a woman named Catherine, who had always preferred the comforts of her parlor to the realities of the fields, found herself overwhelmed by debts she had not known existed and decisions she had no preparation to make. Within 3 months of the colonel's death, the plantation was sold to satisfy his creditors. The land went to a consortium of investors from New Orleans. The enslaved people, considered assets of the estate, were to be sold as well, scattered to different buyers according to the demands of the market and the settlement of debts. This was the normal machinery of slavery, the brutal economics that treated human beings as liquid assets to be bought and sold and divided according to the needs of white commerce. But something unexpected happened in those months between the colonel's death and the final dissolution of his estate. Several enslaved people, including Naomi, simply disappeared. They vanished in the night, slipping away during the chaos and confusion of the estate sale, taking advantage of the reduced supervision and the general disorder that attended the transition of ownership. By the time anyone thought to do a proper accounting, at least 8 people were gone, and no one could say exactly when they had left or where they might have gone. Elijah was among those who disappeared. So was Sarah, the young woman whose fierce anger Naomi had counseled toward patience. So were 2 brothers who had worked in the stables and a woman named Ruth who had been a cook in the main house. They left no trace, no trail, no indication of their route or destination. They simply ceased to exist in the records and ledgers of the Whitmore estate, as though they had been absorbed back into the land that had held them for so long. The truth, which no white person in Natchez ever learned, was that Naomi had spent her final weeks on the plantation, preparing not just her own escape, but the escape of anyone who was willing to risk the journey. She had used the knowledge Isaiah had given her, the understanding of the river and the land, the careful observation of routes and safe passages. She had made contact through networks of communication that existed invisibly beneath the surface of plantation life, with conductors on the Underground Railroad who could guide them north. On a moonless night in late August of 1849, when the river was running low and the cotton was high in the fields, Naomi led her group away from the plantation and toward freedom. They moved in silence, following paths she had memorized, avoiding roads and open ground, using the landscape itself as cover and concealment. They traveled at night and hid during the day, moving slowly and carefully, taking no unnecessary risks, trusting in Naomi's judgment and her knowledge of the land. Elijah, despite his age, moved with a determination that belied his years. He had spent 6 decades in bondage, and he was willing to die in pursuit of freedom rather than live another day as property. Sarah, her fierce anger now channeled into disciplined purpose, helped the others keep up the pace and maintain silence when fear or exhaustion threatened to make them careless. Ruth, who had spent years cooking for the Whitmore family, used her knowledge of preserved foods and foraging to keep them fed when their limited supplies ran low. They reached the Ohio River 3 weeks later, guided part of the way by conductors who appeared and disappeared like ghosts, helping them cross the most dangerous sections, warning them away from areas where slave catchers were known to patrol, guiding them toward safe houses and allies. The crossing of the Ohio was terrifying, done in darkness with borrowed boats and the constant fear of discovery, but they made it. They reached the northern shore and stepped onto free soil for the first time in their lives. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in who they were and what they understood themselves to be. Not all of them stayed together after that. Some continued north to Canada, seeking distance and safety from the reach of the fugitive slave law. Others settled in free black communities in Ohio and Pennsylvania, building new lives with new names, always watchful, always aware that their freedom was precarious and dependent on constant vigilance. Naomi herself traveled to a small town in upstate New York, where she found work as a seamstress and began the slow process of building a life that was entirely her own. But she never forgot the river. She never forgot Isaiah or the morning when justice had been served not by law or government or any human institution, but by the simple act of one woman refusing to accept that power was permanent and unchangeable. She never spoke publicly about what had happened on the riverbank that gray morning in June, never wrote it down, never confessed it to anyone except years later to a small group of women who gathered in her home on winter evenings to share stories of resistance and survival. To those women, in the safety of her small parlor with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, she told the truth. She told them about the years of planning, the patient waiting, the careful preparation. She told them about the moment when Colonel Whitmore had finally understood that he was not invulnerable, that the power he had wielded so carelessly could be taken from him, that justice existed beyond the boundaries of the laws that had been written to protect him. She told them about the river, about how it had accepted her offering, about how it had taken back what had been stolen from it. And when she finished her story, the women sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing what they had heard. Then one of them, an older woman who had herself escaped from slavery many years before, reached across and took Naomi's hand. She said that some debts could only be paid in blood and water, and that the world was richer for having people like Naomi in it, people who understood that justice sometimes required personal courage and personal risk, people who were willing to be the instruments of balance when all other instruments had failed. The story of Naomi spread, though it spread quietly, through networks of formerly enslaved people who gathered in churches and homes and secret meetings. It spread in fragments and pieces, growing and changing as stories do, accumulating embellishments and alterations, becoming myth even as the historical facts remained known to a small core of people who had been there or who had heard it from those who had been there. In some versions, Naomi became a kind of avenging angel, leading dozens of enslaved people to freedom. In other versions, the colonel's death became more dramatic, more violent, more satisfying as a tale of revenge. But those who had known her, who had heard her tell the story in her own words, remembered a different truth. They remembered that she had not been superhuman or magical or blessed with special powers. She had simply been a woman who had suffered an unbearable loss and who had decided that suffering would not be the end of her story. She had used the tools available to her, her knowledge and patience and careful observation, to create an opportunity where none had existed. She had acted with cold calculation and moral certainty, and she had succeeded not because she was stronger or more clever than her oppressor, but because she had been willing to risk everything for a moment of justice. The plantation where Naomi had been enslaved eventually fell into ruin. The new owners from New Orleans never quite made it profitable, and over the years it changed hands several times before being abandoned altogether. The great house, which had once hosted parties and balls for the finest families of Natchez, slowly crumbled as weather and neglect took their toll. The fields grew wild with brush and young trees. The quarters where enslaved people had lived were torn down or left to collapse on their own. Within 2 generations, there was almost nothing left to show that hundreds of people had lived and worked and suffered there. But the river remained. The Mississippi continued to flow as it had for thousands of years, carrying silt and water from the distant north down to the Gulf of Mexico, defining the landscape, providing life, and occasionally taking it indifferent to the human dramas that played out along its banks. And in the flow of that river, in the eternal movement of water, following the paths of least resistance, carving new channels and abandoning old ones, there was a kind of justice that transcended human law and human cruelty. Naomi lived to see the end of slavery. She was 40 years old when the Civil War began, 45 when it ended, and she lived another 30 years beyond that, dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 75, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had been born free and who knew slavery only as a terrible story from the past. She had married late in life to a man who had also escaped from bondage, and together they had built a life of quiet dignity and hard-won peace. In her final years, she would sometimes sit by a window overlooking a small creek that ran through her property, watching the water move over stones and around obstacles, always flowing, always finding its way forward. People who visited her noticed that she seemed to find great comfort in watching running water, and some thought it was simply the peaceful contemplation of an old woman at the end of her life. But those who knew her story understood that she was remembering, that she was maintaining a connection to something that had defined her, that she was honoring a debt that had been paid, and a brother who had been lost, and a river that had served as the instrument of justice when all other instruments had failed. When she died, her funeral was attended by more than 100 people, black and white, who had known her as a seamstress, a neighbor, a friend, a wise woman who gave good counsel, and who had lived through times that younger generations could barely imagine. The preacher at her funeral spoke of her kindness, her generosity, her strong faith, and her commitment to her community. He did not mention the Whitmore plantation or the Mississippi River or the morning when she had made a master beg for his life. Those stories were not for public consumption, not for white ears, not for the official record. But after the funeral, when the mourners had gathered at her home to share food and memories, some of the older people told different stories. They spoke of Naomi as a symbol of resistance, as proof that even in our darkest times, even under the most oppressive systems, individual people could find ways to fight back, to demand justice, to refuse to accept their assigned place in an unjust order. They told her story to the younger generation, not as encouragement to violence or revenge, but as a reminder that agency and power could exist even in powerlessness, that patience and planning could overcome brute force, and that justice, though often delayed, could find its way forward like water flowing downhill, following paths invisible to those who did not know how to look. The legacy of Naomi's story extended far beyond her own lifetime. In the decades after her death, as historians began to document the true history of slavery and the various forms of resistance that enslaved people had employed, her story was occasionally referenced, though always with careful euphemism and academic distance. Scholars wrote about the subtle forms of resistance that existed on plantations, the ways that enslaved people maintained their humanity and agency, even under brutal oppression. They documented cases of mysterious accidents that befell particularly cruel masters, of unexplained disappearances, of fires and poisonings and acts of sabotage that were never officially solved, but that everyone in the enslaved community understood. Naomi's story fit into that broader narrative, one piece of a much larger mosaic of resistance and resilience. She was not unique in her refusal to accept injustice, not alone in her willingness to risk everything for a moment of justice. She was part of a tradition of resistance that extended from the first moment that enslaved Africans were brought to American shores to the final moment when slavery was legally abolished. Her story was one voice in a chorus of voices, one act in a long drama of human struggle against oppression. But what made her story particularly powerful, what gave it resonance and meaning that lasted long after she was gone, was the way it demonstrated that resistance did not always look like rebellion. It did not always involve violence or confrontation or dramatic escape attempts. Sometimes resistance looked like patience, like careful observation, like slowly gathering knowledge and waiting for the right moment. Sometimes resistance looked like a woman saving her master's life so that she could later take it on her own terms, in her own time, in a way that served justice rather than chaos. Her story reminded people that power was not absolute, that systems of oppression, no matter how total they seemed, contained within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. Every act of cruelty created the possibility of retribution. Every exercise of power created knowledge that could later be used against the powerful. Every moment of supposed submission could be storing up energy for eventual resistance. The masters who thought they had total control over the people they enslaved had failed to understand the most basic truth about human nature, that the desire for freedom and justice could not be beaten out of people, could not be bought or sold, could not be legislated or forced into submission. It could only be temporarily suppressed, waiting like a seed in the ground for the right conditions to sprout. And so Naomi's story became, in its way, a story about hope. Not easy hope, not naive hope, but the hard, patient hope of people who understood that change might not come in their lifetime, but who planted seeds for future generations nonetheless. It was the hope of people who knew that every small act of resistance, every refusal to accept injustice, every insistence on one's own humanity and agency contributed to a larger movement toward freedom that might take generations to fully realize. When we remember Naomi today, more than a century and a half after she made her master beg for his life on the banks of the Mississippi River, we remember not just her individual act of justice, but what that act represents. We remember that ordinary people, given no weapons but their own intelligence and courage, can find ways to resist even the most oppressive systems. We remember that justice, though often delayed and denied, has a way of asserting itself, like water finding its way through rock, patient and persistent and ultimately unstoppable. We remember that every system of oppression relies on the cooperation, willing or forced, of those it oppresses, and that when individuals decide to withdraw that cooperation, when they decide to use their knowledge and agency in service of justice rather than submission, the entire structure of oppression becomes vulnerable. We remember that change begins not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, though those have their place, but with individual people making individual decisions, that power is not permanent, that cruelty will not go unanswered, and that justice is worth pursuing even at great personal risk. The river that witnessed Naomi's act of justice still flows today, carrying water from the north to the Gulf, defining the landscape, shaping the land through which it passes, and in that river's flow, in its patient reshaping of the world, in its indifference to human attempts to control or contain it, there is a lesson about justice itself. Justice, like water, will find its way forward. It may be blocked temporarily, diverted, forced into channels not of its own choosing, but given time, given the patient determination of people who refuse to accept injustice, it will flow where it needs to flow, reshape what needs to be reshaped, and carry away what needs to be carried away. Naomi of Natchez understood this truth in her bones. She understood that the river did not belong to her master, no matter how much he tried to use it as an instrument of control. She understood that some forces in the universe are larger than human cruelty, older than human systems of oppression, more patient than human spans of life. And she understood that by aligning herself with those forces, by making herself an instrument of balance and justice, she could help tip the scales in a direction they needed to tip. Her story reminds us that we too live in a world where injustice is common, where power is often abused, where systems of oppression continue to function long after they should have been dismantled. And her story tells us that we too have agency, that we too can observe and learn and plan and wait for the right moment to act. It tells us that justice requires courage, but also patience, that it requires anger, but also calculation, that it requires a willingness to risk everything, but also the wisdom to know when that risk might actually accomplish something. Above all, Naomi's story tells us that every human being, no matter how oppressed or powerless they may seem, carries within themselves the capacity for agency, for choice, for resistance, for justice. That capacity may be constrained by circumstance, threatened by violence, suppressed by systems designed to break the human spirit. But it cannot be extinguished entirely. It persists like a seed in the ground, waiting for the conditions that will allow it to sprout and grow. And when it does sprout, when that capacity for agency and resistance finally finds expression, it has the power to reshape the world, one act of courage at a time. The slave girl who made her master beg for his life did not change the entire system of slavery. She did not free all the enslaved people in Mississippi or bring about the immediate end of oppression. But she proved something that needed proving, that power was not absolute, that justice could be pursued even by those who had been denied it by law and custom, and that the human spirit, once awakened to its own strength, was as powerful and inevitable as the river that flows forever toward the sea. And in a world that often seems overwhelming in its injustice, that proof, that reminder of human agency and courage, is itself a form of hope worth holding on to, worth remembering, and worth passing down to generations yet to come.